What you are about to hear is a true story. The darkness inside the cabin was not merely an absence of light, it was a physical weight. It was heavy with the scent of unwashed wool, stale tobacco, and the metallic tang of terror. It was the deep, suffocating black of a mine shaft. It was broken only by the erratic orange gasp of a dying coal oil lamp. The lamp cast long, jittering shadows against the rough-hewn log walls. Inside, 5 men stood with their backs pressed against each other, a defensive rosette of lever-action rifles and wide, staring eyes. These were not soft men. They were prospectors. Fred Beck, Gabe Lefevre, John Peterson, Marion Smith, and his son Roy. Men who spoke the language of dynamite and geology. They understood the known dangers of the Washington Territory, the slip of a scree slope, the charge of a frightened bear, the bitter snap of hypothermia. But they did not understand the thunder on the roof. Thud. The sound was wet and heavy, like a sack of wet cement dropped from a great height. The cedar shakes of the roof groaned under the impact. Dust motes danced in the lamp's light. They were shaken loose from the rafters. Crack. Another impact. The cabin was a sturdy fortress built of fir logs meant to withstand winter snowpack, but it shuddered in its foundation. This was not the wind. This was not a rock slide. This was a bombardment. "Kill the light," Beck whispered. His voice was a dry rasp. "They can see the light." The flame was extinguished. It plunged them into absolute, abyssal blindness. The sounds outside changed. The artillery fire of stones ceased. It was replaced by a silence that was somehow louder. A heavy, breathing silence. Then came the sound that would haunt Fred Beck for the remaining 40 years of his life. It was the sound of heavy, calloused palms testing the structure. Slap. Slap. The heavy door, barred with a thick pine bracing, groaned inward. The wood shrieked. Something massive was leaning against it. It was testing the tensile strength of the iron hinges. In the dark, the men could hear the chinking. The dried moss and mud packed between the logs was being picked away. Scritch. Scritch. Rip. A cold draft of high-altitude air hissed into the room. "They're coming in," Roy Smith whimpered. The bravado of the morning had completely evaporated. "Hold your fire," Beck commanded, though his own grip on the Winchester was slick with sweat. "Wait for a target." The cabin was no longer a shelter. It was a wooden lung, and it was being squeezed. To understand the terror of that night, one must first understand the arrogance of the morning. July in the Cascades is a deception. In the valleys, the air is thick with the scent of blackberries and warm pine resin. But up here, on the shoulder of Mount St. Helens, the air was thin and sharp. It carried the ancient, sulfurous memory of the volcano. It was 1924. The world below was dancing the Charleston and recovering from the Great War. But up at the timberline, the calendar was irrelevant. The spot was known as the Vander White Claim, a jagged scar of earth near a gorge that would later be christened Ape Canyon. But at the time, it was simply the claim. A place where the earth promised gold if you were willing to bleed for it. Fred Beck and his companions were not tourists. They were intruders. They had spent the last week blasting the cliff face with dynamite. The explosions rolled down the valley like thunderclaps. They announced their dominion over the mountain. They were loud. They were confident. They were the apex predators of the industrial age. Or so they thought. The weirdness had started slowly. It crept in like a fog. It began with the tracks. On a Tuesday, while hauling water from the spring, Gabe Lefevre had stopped dead. His boot hovered over a patch of soft river mud. "Fred," he called out. His voice was pitched low. Beck had walked over. He expected bear sign. What he saw made the hair on his forearm stand up like copper wire. The print was there, pressed deep into the sediment. It was human in shape, a heel, an arch, 5 toes. But the proportions were grotesque. It measured 19 inches from heel to toe. It was too wide. It was too flat. The stride length between the prints suggested a creature that walked with a casual power, a power that defied human physiology. "Bear," Beck had said. He was lying to himself. Double step. A black bear slipping in the mud. Lefevre hadn't argued, but he had racked around into the chamber of his rifle. Then came the whistling. It wasn't the chaotic chatter of jays or the mournful cry of an owl. It was melodic, calculated. A shrill, piercing whistle from the ridge line above, followed 3 seconds later by an answering whistle from the valley floor below. It was a grid. Someone, or something, was coordinating. They were signaling the miner's position. The men tried to ignore it. Gold fever is a potent blinder. They kept digging. They kept blasting. They kept eating their beans and bacon by the fire. They laughed too loudly. They tried to drown out the sensation of eyes watching from the tree line. The inciting incident arrived with the sun high and bright. It cast no shadows to hide in. It was near noon. Fred Beck and one of the Smiths were walking back from the spring. Water buckets sloshed against their denim legs. They looked across the narrow gorge. There, on the opposite cliff face, about 80 yards away, something was standing. The brain tries to categorize the unknown. It flips through a Rolodex of safe images. Tree stump, bear, shadow, man. Beck's mind stalled. The figure was standing on 2 legs. It peered around a large pine tree. It was covered in dark, matted hair, the color of wet bark. It stood at least 7 feet tall. But it was the face that froze Beck's blood. It wasn't the snout of a bear. It was a flat, dark visage with deep-set eyes and a heavy brow ridge. It looked distinctly, terrifyingly human, but wrong. Like a man viewed through a distorted mirror. The creature stepped out from behind the tree. It didn't run. It didn't cower. It looked at them. In 1924, you didn't pull out a phone to record. You didn't contemplate the anthropological significance of a relic hominid. In 1924, if you were a man in the wilderness and you saw a monster, you killed it. It was a reflex born of fear and dominion. Beck raised his rifle. The iron sight settled on the dark mass of the creature's chest. The world narrowed down to that notch in the metal. The wind stopped. The bird stopped. There was only the heavy thump of Beck's heart in his ears. He squeezed the trigger. Crack! The rifle bucked against his shoulder. Across the canyon, the creature jerked violently. The impact of the heavy caliber bullet was visible. A shudder ran through its massive frame. It didn't scream. It didn't roar. It simply tipped backward, like a felled tree, and plummeted off the ledge. Beck and Smith rushed to the edge of the gorge. Adrenaline flooded their systems. It washed away the fear and replaced it with the high of the kill. They peered down into the abyss. The canyon walls were sheer. They dropped hundreds of feet into a tangle of slide alder and basalt. There was no body, just the swaying of branches far below. "You got him," Smith said. His voice was trembling. "You got the devil." But as they stood there, scanning the depths, a sound echoed from the ridge above them. A low, guttural roaring. Then another whistle. Sharp, angry, immediate. This time the answer didn't come from the valley floor. It came from the trees to their left. Then the trees to their right. Beck lowered his rifle. The cold realization settled in his gut like a stone. He hadn't ended the threat. He had started a war. "We need to get to the cabin," Beck said. He backed away from the edge. "Now." They didn't run, not yet. They walked with stiff, jerky movements. They checked their 6. Their eyes darted into the impenetrable green wall of the forest. The woods, which had seemed so majestic that morning, now looked like the bars of a cage. Every snapping twig sounded like a footstep. Every shadow looked like a hairy shoulder. They reached the cabin as the sun began to dip behind the peaks. It cast long, purple shadows across the Vanderwhite claim. They told the others. There was no mockery, no skepticism. The look in Beck's eyes told them everything they needed to know. The 1,000-yard stare of a man who has seen the impossible. They reinforced the door. They checked ammunition. And then, as the last light of day bled out of the sky, turning the snow on Mount St. Helens a bruised gray, the first rock hit the roof. The transition from day to night on the mountain is usually a gradual surrender, a softening of edges until the world is gray. But that night, the darkness fell like a guillotine. Beck sat on a crate near the rear wall. His rifle was across his knees. He was listening to the silence. It was a heavy, pressurized silence, the kind that precedes a tornado. He tried to rationalize what had happened on the cliff. A bear, his mind whispered. Just a bear standing on its hind legs. But the memory of that face, flat, intelligent, and eerily calm, would not be displaced. Thump. It started again. This time, it wasn't the roof. It was the wall directly behind John Peterson's head. The impact was so violent that the dried mud chinking exploded inward. It dusted Peterson's hair with grit. He scrambled forward. He tripped over his own boots. He cursed in a whisper. "They're throwing rocks," Lefevre said. His voice was tight. "Those aren't rocks," Beck replied. "That's a boulder. A man couldn't throw a rock that heavy." The bombardment intensified. It wasn't random. The rocks slammed into the cabin from 3 sides simultaneously. They kept the men pinned in the center of the room. The noise was deafening. The sharp crack of stone on wood. The dull thud of heavy impacts. The rattle of the pans hanging on the wall. Then, the tactics changed. The rocks stopped. Footsteps, heavy, bipedal and deliberate, crunched on the gravel outside. They were slow, heavy. Crunch, pause, crunch. The men raised their rifles. They tracked the sounds through the walls. They were tracking multiple targets. 1 near the door, 2 on the south wall, 1 on the roof. The sound of the roof walker was the worst. The cabin structure creaked under the weight. Dust sifted down from the ceiling boards. It sounded like a heavy man pacing directly above their heads. "He's trying to find a weak spot," Marion Smith whispered. Suddenly the pacing stopped. A tremendous crash shook the cabin as something slammed onto the roof. A heavy object was being used as a battering ram against the chimney pipe. "They're trying to smoke us out," Beck realized. "Or come down." Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in the room. This wasn't animal behavior. Animals flee fire and noise. Animals do not understand chimneys. The men fired. The muzzle flashes lit up the cabin like a strobe light. They revealed terrified faces, frozen in grimaces of shock. The bullets punched through the roof. They splintered the cedar shakes. A howl erupted from above, not a scream of pain, but a roar of frustration. The weight on the roof shifted, followed by the sound of a heavy body leaping to the ground. The impact shook the floorboards. For a moment, there was silence. The smell of cordite stung their noses. Then came the hand. It happened in the corner of the cabin where the logs had settled unevenly. There was a gap in the chinking about 4 inches wide. An axe leaned against the wall there. In the dim light of the dying embers, Beck saw it. Something was pushing through the gap. It was a hand. A massive, hairy hand, broad as a shovel, with thick black fingernails. It wasn't groping blindly. It was searching. The fingers curled around the handle of the axe. "It's got the axe!" someone screamed. The absurdity of the moment was paralyzing. A monster was trying to steal a weapon. Beck lunged. He didn't shoot. He reacted with pure instinct. He grabbed the head of the axe. He pulled back. For a second, he was locked in a tug of war with the creature on the other side of the wall. He could feel the power of it, a raw, hydraulic strength that made his own muscles feel like thread. The creature grunted, a low, wet sound just inches from Beck's face. separated only by a layer of pine. "Shoot it!" Beck yelled. His boots slid on the floor as he lost ground. Marion Smith leveled his revolver and fired at the gap. The bullet smashed into the wood inches from the hand. The creature recoiled instantly. The hand whipped back through the hole with impossible speed. The axe clattered to the floor. Beck fell back, gasping. He stared at the gap in the wall. He had felt it. It was warm. It was alive. It was strong enough to tear him apart. The rest of the night dissolved into a blur of hallucinatory terror. The thicket of the experience became dense and confusing. The creatures didn't just attack. They taunted. They mimicked the men. At one point, Beck heard a voice, or a sound trying to be a voice, mimicking the cadence of their speech. It was a gibberish jargon, low and guttural. It sounded like rocks grinding together, blah, 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 mocking them from the darkness. Were there 2 of them? 5? 10? The noise suggested a legion. The rocks kept coming, but they never broke down the door. They could have. Beck knew that now. With the strength he had felt on the axe handle, they could have dismantled the cabin log by log. Why didn't they? It wasn't a slaughter. It was an eviction. The men huddled in the center of the room, rifles trained on the door. They watched the gray light of dawn slowly, agonizingly, bleed through the cracks in the walls. They were exhausted. Their nerves were frayed to the snapping point. As the sun crested the ridge, the bombardment stopped. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the noise. Was it a trap? Finally, Beck moved to the door. He unbarred it. The wood was splintered and gouged. He pushed it open. The morning light was blinding. The scene outside was a moonscape of violence. The ground around the cabin was littered with rocks, hundreds of them. Some were small stones. Others were 50-pound boulders that had been hauled up from the creek bed. The cabin walls were scarred and pitted. The roof was a ruin of splintered cedar, but the creatures were gone. "Leave it," Beck said. "Leave everything." They didn't pack. They didn't check the mine. They didn't retrieve their tools. They grabbed their rifles and the keys to the car, a battered overland touring car parked miles down the logging road, and they ran. It wasn't a sprint. It was a forced march of paranoia. They moved back to back, scanning the tree line. The forest felt different now. It wasn't empty. It was occupied. Every shadow held a shape. Every rustle of fern was a footstep. They reached the edge of the canyon, the spot where the road ended and the trail began. The car was there, untouched, a relic of the civilized world that seemed impossibly distant. As they fumbled with the crank to start the engine, Beck paused. The feeling of being watched was an itch in the center of his back. He turned slowly. He raised his eyes to the ridgeline high above the canyon. He saw it. Standing on a prominence of rock, silhouetted against the morning sky, was a figure. It wasn't hiding. It wasn't stalking. It was watching them leave. It stood with its arms hanging loosely at its sides. Even at this distance, 400 yards or more, the size of the thing was apparent. It dominated the landscape. Beck raised his Winchester. He could take the shot. He could try to kill it again. But he lowered the rifle. Why? Perhaps it was the range. Perhaps it was the ammunition he had wasted the night before. Or perhaps, in the cold light of day, he realized the truth. He had shot one. They had come back with reinforcements. If he shot this one, would they follow them home? Would they come down from the mountain? The creature on the ridge didn't move. It simply watched, a silent sentinel ensuring the intruders were truly gone. Beck turned his back on the mountain. "Let's go," he said. The engine sputtered to life, a coughing, mechanical intrusion in the silence. They put distance between themselves and the impossible, but the story didn't end on the mountain. It followed them down. When they reached the town of Kelso, they were pale, shaking, and insistent. They went to the hospital first. Beck had been hit in the head by a rock inside the cabin and was dizzy. Then, they went to the authorities. The story hit the wires. Miners attacked by giant apes. It was front-page fodder. It was ridiculous. It was terrifying. The Forest Service was forced to respond. Rangers J.H. Huffman and William Welch were dispatched to the site. They were men of science, skeptics who believed in bears and pranksters, not monsters. Their investigation was a masterclass in confirmation bias. They found the cabin. They saw the rocks littered everywhere. They saw the splintered roof. They found the tracks. "Look at this," Huffman sneered. He pointed to a footprint in the mud. "Knuckles." "Knuckles?" Welch asked. "The print. It has knuckle marks. Bears walk on their knuckles. It's just a bear." He was ignoring the anatomy. Bears do not have 5 distinct toes that splay like a human's. Bears do not have a 19-inch foot. And bears do not coordinate group attacks involving projectile weapons. But the Rangers had a narrative to maintain. They couldn't go back to headquarters and report that the woods were full of hairy giants. That would cause panic. So they wrote their report. Miners hallucinated, or it was a prank by boys from the YMCA camp. A prank by boys who hiked 10 miles uphill in the dark carrying 50-pound boulders to assault armed miners with lethal force. It was a laughable explanation, but it was safe. The miners stuck to their story. They were ridiculed. They were called drunks. They were called liars. But they never went back. They abandoned the Vander White claim. They left the gold in the ground. You don't walk away from a gold mine because of a prank. You walk away because you know that the land belongs to someone else. The investigation fizzled. The skeptics won the headlines. The miners retreated into obscurity, marked by the event, forever looking over their shoulders. But the mountain wasn't done. A story like this does not simply fade, it festers. It becomes folklore, then legend, then myth. But unlike most myths, which soften with time, the legend of Ape Canyon grew teeth. The miners eventually died, taking their trauma to the grave. Fred Beck, the man who pulled the trigger, wrote a small booklet in 1967. I Fought the Ape Men of Mount St. Helens. In it, he tried to spiritualize the event. He claimed the creatures were interdimensional beings. It was a coping mechanism. It is easier to believe you fought a ghost than to accept you fought a biological reality that science refuses to acknowledge. If they were ghosts, they couldn't follow you home. If they were flesh and blood, they could. But the mountain kept its receipts. In 1950, the echo of 1924 returned. Jim Carter, an experienced skier and mountaineer, vanished on the slopes of Mount St. Helens. He was young, fit, and knew the terrain. He had skied down the mountain ahead of his party, aiming for a landmark called Dog's Head. He never made it. Searchers found his ski tracks. They told a story of sudden, inexplicable panic. Carter was a skilled skier, yet his tracks showed him taking insane risks, jumping crevasses, straight-lining down steep slopes, careening wildly as if fleeing a predator. The tracks didn't lead to the lodge. They led directly into the maw of Ape Canyon. And there, they stopped. Dr. Bob Lee, a member of the search party, later described the sensation of being in that canyon during the search. "It was the most eerie experience I've ever had," he said. "I felt like I was being watched." They found a film box Carter had dropped. They found nothing else. No body, no skis. Just footprints that ended at the edge of the abyss, and the lingering sense that the mountain devils were still enforcing their borders. On May 18th, 1980, at 8:32 a.m., the debate was rendered moot. Mount St. Helens didn't just erupt, it disintegrated. The north flank of the mountain collapsed in the largest terrestrial landslide in recorded history. The energy released was equivalent to 24 megatons of thermal energy. The force of the blast scoured the landscape. It stripped the trees. It boiled the Spirit Lake. And it buried Ape Canyon. The site of the cabin? Gone. The cliff where Beck shot the creature? obliterated. The footprints, the shell casings, the Vander White mine. All of it was buried under hundreds of feet of gray ash, mud, and pumice. The mountain erased the evidence. It was the ultimate cover-up, executed by the earth itself. Today you can hike the Ape Canyon trail. It is a beautiful, haunting place. The trees are regrowing young and green against the stark gray of the volcanic soil. The wind still whistles through the ridges, sometimes sounding like a bird, sometimes sounding like a signal. You can stand there and look out over the devastation, now blooming with life, and feel the weight of the history. The skeptics will tell you it was all a hoax. They will tell you about feral humans or pranksters or bears walking on hind legs. They will cite the lack of a body, the lack of DNA, the lack of a specimen in a museum. But the believers and the psychological profilers look at the behavior. They look at the coordination, the use of projectile weapons, the siege tactics, the intimidation, the curiosity, the mercy. They let the men leave. These are not the actions of a dumb animal. Fred Beck and his crew were the invaders. They brought dynamite and noise to a sanctuary that had been silent for 1,000 years. They were warned. The whistling. They ignored the warning. They drew first blood. And they were evicted. The story of Ape Canyon is not a ghost story. It is a war story. It is a reminder that there are still dark corners of this continent where we are not the masters, where the woods do not belong to us, where we are watched, tolerated, and occasionally, when we cross the line, we are hunted. As you lay in bed tonight, safe in your locked home, listening to the wind rattle the window pane, ask yourself, if you heard a thump on the roof, would you look? Or would you turn off the light, pull the covers up, and pray that whatever is outside is just passing through? Because in the end, we are all just guests, and the landlord is listening. While the narrative in this story is dramatized for effect, the core details are drawn directly from the historical record: the names of the miners, the dates, the specific behaviors of the creatures, throwing rocks, the hand in the cabin, the whistling, and the subsequent investigation by Rangers Huffman and Welch. And the 1950 disappearance of Jim Carter is a documented cold case that remains unsolved to this day. This story is called The Night of the Mountain Devils, written and performed by the author, me, James Cawley. There is a specific kind of arrogance in thinking we can own a mountain. We blast the rock, we map the ridges, and we name the canyons after our own fears, convinced that because we have a ledger and a rifle, the land has been tamed. But the events of 1924 remind us that we are often just uninvited guests in a house that was never meant for us. Whether those creatures were flesh and blood or something born of the mountain's own restless spirit doesn't change the weight of that night. The mountain eventually took it all back anyway. The cabin, the mine, the footprints, bearing the truth under millions of tons of ash and fire. Perhaps that was the final word, a reminder that some secrets aren't meant to be solved. They are simply meant to be respected from a distance. My name is James Cawley, and you're listening to Dust and Echoes. If you like stories like this, stories that scrape against the thin wall of what we call reality, leaving us wondering what creature lurks outside as we lie shivering in the dark, then you're in the right place. I'm glad we found you. I release a new original story in cinematic audiobook format every single week, right here. I think you'll love my next story. Until next time, remember this: nature will never need to speak to be understood. It only waits for us to realize that our ego, our technology, our sense of superiority is our greatest weakness.